10 years later, Margaret walked back into that hospital room where John lay broken and alone, abandoned by the woman he thought loved him. His trembling hand reached out desperately as tears streamed down his face. "Please don't leave me," he whispered. The same words his wife had begged him with on that dusty roadside years ago. But this time, it was Margaret who held all the power. She could walk away, let him taste the bitter medicine of abandonment he'd forced her to swallow. Instead, she took his shaking hand in hers and said the words that would change everything. "I didn't come back for revenge, John. I came back to take care of you." In that moment, the woman he'd left with nothing but the clothes on her back had returned with something he'd thrown away and never found again: the strength of true love. But how did that broken woman become this tower of grace? And what happened in those 10 years that transformed abandonment into the greatest comeback story you'll ever hear? The old pickup truck came to a screeching halt on that dusty country road, kicking up clouds of red dirt that seemed to swallow everything around it. John's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white, and when he finally looked over at his wife Margaret sitting there beside him, his eyes were cold as winter morning frost. "Get out," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife through butter. Margaret's heart just about stopped right there in her chest. What do you mean, honey?" she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. "I mean, get out of my truck, woman, right here, right now." John's words hit her like a slap across the face, and she felt her world start spinning out of control. "John, please, we can talk about this. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it together. We always have." Tears started rolling down her cheeks, making little trails through the dust that had settled on her face during their long, silent drive. But John just reached across her and opened the passenger door with a violent push. "There ain't nothing to fix, Margaret. This is over. We're over." The hot summer air rushed into the truck like a furnace blast, and Margaret could feel the scorching sun beating down on the asphalt outside. Cars and trucks rushed past them on that lonely highway, creating little whirlwinds of dust and debris, but not a single one slowed down. "Please don't do this," she begged, grabbing onto his arm with both hands. "I don't understand what I did wrong. Just tell me what I did wrong and I'll fix it." John shook her hands off like she was some kind of pest bothering him at a picnic. "You didn't do nothing wrong, Margaret. That's the problem. You're not what I want anymore." And with that, he gave her a push toward the open door. Margaret stumbled out onto the burning pavement, her bare feet hitting the scorching asphalt like she was stepping on hot coals. The little sundress she was wearing, the yellow one with tiny flowers that John used to say made her look pretty, suddenly felt like nothing more than a piece of cloth in a hurricane. "John!" she cried out, running after the truck as it started pulling away. "John, please don't leave me here." But he never even looked back. The truck disappeared down that endless ribbon of highway, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and the echo of an engine fading into the distance. Margaret stood there in the middle of nowhere, watching until she couldn't see even a speck of that truck anymore. The sun was beating down merciless, and sweat was already starting to mix with her tears. She looked around at the empty landscape stretching out in every direction, nothing but fields of brown grass, and a road that seemed to go on forever. But that cruel abandonment wasn't the end. 10 years later, this same woman would return to change everyone's life in ways no one ever imagined. Before we continue this emotional story, put in the comments below which city you're watching from. It'll be a pleasure to give your comment a little heart. Now let's continue this exciting story. While Margaret was out there walking those dusty roads with nowhere to go, John was living it up like he'd just won the lottery. And boy, did he think he had. Just 2 weeks after leaving his wife stranded, there he was at Murphy's bar, showing off his new girlfriend like she was some kind of prize he'd won at the county fair. Her name was Crystal, and she was everything Margaret wasn't. Young, flashy, with bleached blonde hair that caught the light just right, and a smile that could make any man forget his own name. "This here's my lady," John would tell anyone who'd listen, his arm wrapped tight around Crystal's tiny waist. "Ain't she something else?" Crystal would giggle and bat her long eyelashes, whispering sweet things in his ear that made him puff up like a rooster in a henhouse. "Oh, Johnny," she'd coo, "you're going to be so successful, I can just feel it. We're going to have everything we ever dreamed of." And John, well, he ate it up like honey on a biscuit, started buying himself fancy shirts that cost more than he used to spend on groceries in a month, got himself a new truck, shiny red with chrome bumpers that reflected the sun like mirrors, even started talking different, using words he'd heard on TV shows about rich folks. The parties started coming fast and regular. Crystal knew all kinds of people. the kind who wore expensive watches and talked loud about business deals over whiskey that cost more per bottle than most folks made in a week. They'd slap John on the back and call him partner, promising him opportunities that were going to make him rich beyond his wildest dreams. "We're talking big money here, Johnny boy," they'd say, smoke from their cigars curling up toward the ceiling like promises floating away. "Shall you stick with us? And you'll never have to worry about nothing again." Crystal would hang on his arm during these conversations, her red fingernails tracing circles on his chest, while she whispered in his ear about all the fancy things they were going to buy together. A big house with a swimming pool, she'd say, maybe one of them convertible cars like in the movies. John felt like he was living in a dream. All those years with Margaret, working hard just to scrape by, and now here he was with a woman who believed in him, who saw his potential, who made him feel like he could conquer the world. But late at night, when Crystal thought he was sleeping, he'd catch her on the phone talking in hushed tones to someone whose voice he couldn't quite make out. "Don't worry," she'd whisper. "Everything's going according to plan." But the glow of bright lights often hides deep shadows, and when the mask finally slipped, it would be far too late. Margaret walked for what felt like forever, her bare feet bleeding and blistered from the hot asphalt. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky orange and pink, but all she could think about was finding somewhere safe to spend the night. That's when she saw it, a small white house with a porch light glowing like a beacon in the growing darkness. An elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson answered the door, took one look at Margaret's tear-streaked face and dusty clothes, and knew immediately what had happened. "Oh, honey," Mrs. Henderson said, shaking her grey head sadly. "You're one of them abandoned wives, ain't you?" The words hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. Abandoned wife. That's what she was now. Not Margaret the person, not Margaret who used to laugh and dream and make plans for the future. Just another woman thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. Mrs. Henderson offered her a job cleaning house in exchange for a tiny room in the back and 2 meals a day. It wasn't much, but it was something. Margaret scrubbed floors until her hands were raw and red, washed dishes until her back ached something fierce, and dusted furniture that held more value than everything she'd ever owned. The worst part wasn't the work, though. It was the whispers that followed her wherever she went in that small town. "There goes the abandoned one," people would say when they thought she couldn't hear. "Poor thing. Wonder what she did to make her husband run off like that." At night, lying on that narrow bed in her little room, Margaret would pull her thin blanket up to her chin and cry as quietly as she could. The walls were paper thin, and she didn't want Mrs. Henderson to hear her falling apart piece by piece. "Lord," she'd whisper into the darkness, her voice so soft it was barely more than a breath. "I don't understand why this happened to me. I tried to be a good wife, I tried to do everything right. Some nights the loneliness felt so heavy she could barely breathe." She'd remember the way John used to hold her hand when they watched TV together, or how he'd bring her coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. Those memories hurt worse than any physical pain, but slowly, something started changing inside her. During those long, quiet hours of cleaning and praying, Margaret began to feel something she'd never felt before, a quiet strength growing in her chest, like a seed pushing up through hard ground. She started reading her Bible every morning before work, and the words seemed to speak directly to her broken heart. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted," she'd read, and for the first time since that awful day on the highway, she felt like maybe she wasn't completely alone. What no one could see was the strength being born out of her pain, and soon she would surprise everyone with her courage. 5 years passed like pages turning in a book, and boy, did those years tell 2 different stories. John's life kept getting flashier and emptier at the same time. Crystal had him wrapped around her little finger, and every month brought some new expensive toy she just had to have. His belly started growing soft from all those fancy restaurant dinners and late nights drinking expensive whiskey with his so-called business partners. "Johnny, baby," Crystal would purr, running her fingers through his hair that was getting thinner by the year. "I saw this beautiful necklace at the jewelry store downtown. It would look so perfect on me at the country club dance." And John, poor fool that he was, would hand over his credit card without even looking at the price. His face was getting puffy from all that rich living, and his clothes kept getting tighter, but he was too busy trying to keep up with Crystal's demands to notice how tired he looked in the mirror. Meanwhile, Margaret was becoming someone completely different. She'd saved up enough money from her cleaning jobs to take night classes at the community center, learning bookkeeping and basic computer skills. Her hands were still rough from all that hard work, but her eyes had a clarity that wasn't there before. She'd walk through town now with her head held high, wearing simple but clean clothes that she'd bought with her own money. People started nodding respectfully when they saw her coming. "That Margaret Henderson," they'd say. She'd taken Mrs. Henderson's last name after the old woman passed and left her the little house. "She's made something of herself, hasn't she?" Every Sunday, Margaret would sit in the front pew of the little Baptist church on Main Street, her worn Bible in her lap, singing hymns in a voice that had grown stronger with each passing year. The pastor would sometimes ask her to share her testimony, and she'd stand up with quiet dignity, talking about how God had carried her through her darkest valley. Her hair had grown back to its natural brown color, with just a few threads of silver that caught the light when she moved. She'd learned to drive, got herself a used car that ran good, and started doing bookkeeping for small businesses around town. Every penny she earned went straight into her savings account at the local bank. But John? He was sinking deeper into debt with every passing month. Those business deals his friends promised never seemed to work out, and Crystal's appetite for expensive things kept growing like weeds after rain. But no one escapes the harvest of their own choices, and soon the time of reckoning would come. It started with a phone call that changed everything. John was sitting at his kitchen table, still in his bathrobe at 2 in the afternoon, when his phone rang with news that made his blood run cold. "Sorry, Johnny," came the voice of his business partner, smooth as oil but cold as winter. "That deal we talked about, it fell through. Lost every penny we put into it." John's hands started shaking as he hung up the phone. That was his last $10,000. Money he'd borrowed against the house. Money he'd promised Crystal for that fancy vacation she'd been planning. Speaking of Crystal, she walked into the kitchen right then, all dolled up in a new dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her eyes were harder than he'd ever seen them, like blue ice that wouldn't melt. "Johnny, baby," she said, but there wasn't any sweetness in her voice anymore. "We need to talk about my birthday present. I saw this diamond bracelet at Tiffany's that would be absolutely perfect." John's stomach twisted into knots. "Crystal, honey, maybe we should wait a bit. Money's been tight lately and..." "Tight?" Crystal's voice rose like a storm wind. "What do you mean, tight? You promised me we'd always have everything we wanted. That's what you said when I moved in with you." "I know, sugar, but the business deal went bad and..." Crystal slammed her purse down on the counter so hard it made the coffee cups rattle. "I don't want to hear about your stupid business deals, John. I want that bracelet, and I want it by Friday." Over the next few months, everything started falling apart like a house of cards in a hurricane. Those friends who used to slap him on the back and call him partner, they stopped returning his calls. The fancy restaurants where they used to hold court, the waiters would look the other way when John walked in. Crystal got meaner by the day, her demands growing bigger while John's bank account got smaller. She'd roll her eyes when he tried to explain their financial situation, treating him like he was some kind of failure instead of the man she used to call her king. John started drinking more. First just beer with dinner, then whiskey during the day, then whatever he could get his hands on to numb the pain of watching his perfect life crumble around him. His hands would shake in the morning until he had his first drink, and his eyes got that glassy look that comes from trying to drown your troubles in a bottle. And just when he thought things couldn't possibly get worse, life struck its cruelest blow. It happened on a Tuesday morning while John was arguing with Crystal about another overdue credit card bill. One minute, he was standing in their kitchen, waving that piece of paper in the air like it was going to solve everything, and the next minute, the room started spinning like a carnival ride. The words coming out of his mouth turned to mush, and his left arm went numb as a piece of wood. Crystal screamed when she saw him hit the floor, his body twitching like a fish out of water. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and flashing lights, but John remembered every second of lying in that hospital bed afterward, tubes running in and out of his body like he was some kind of broken machine they were trying to fix. The doctor's words hit him harder than the stroke itself. "I'm afraid the damage is permanent, Mr. Johnson. The left side of your body will likely remain paralyzed." When Crystal walked into his hospital room that evening, John's heart actually skipped a beat with relief. She was still there. She hadn't run off like everyone else. Maybe, just maybe, their love was stronger than he'd thought. "Crystal," he whispered, his speech slurred and thick like molasses. He tried to reach out to her with his good hand, the right one that still worked, fingers trembling with the effort. "I'm so scared, baby. Please don't leave me." Crystal stood there in her designer heels and that blue dress he'd bought her just last month, looking at him like he was something she'd found stuck to the bottom of her shoe. Her pretty face was twisted up in disgust, and her eyes, those eyes that used to look at him like he hung the moon, were cold as winter stone. "Leave you?" she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "John, look at yourself. You can't even feed yourself anymore." John's trembling hand reached toward her, desperate for just one touch, one sign that she still cared about the man who'd given her everything he had. "Please, Crystal, I can get better. The doctors said with therapy." She stepped back like his touch would burn her. "I'm not staying with a cripple, John. I've got my whole life ahead of me, and I'm not going to spend it taking care of some broken-down man who can't even provide for me anymore." The words hit him like a slap across the face. John started crying then, tears rolling down his cheeks as the reality of his situation crashed over him like a cold wave. Crystal turned toward the door without even looking back, her heels clicking on the hospital floor like a countdown to his complete destruction. And in that silence of cruel solitude, guess who walked back into his life? John was staring at the ceiling, counting the water stains, and trying not to think about how alone he was, when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Soft, careful steps that sounded different from the nurses hurried rushing around. When he turned his head toward the door, his heart just about stopped beating right there in his chest. It was Margaret, but not the Margaret he remembered from that dusty roadside 10 years ago. This woman standing in his doorway was different, stronger, taller somehow, even though she was the same height. Her hair was pulled back neat and tidy, with silver threads that caught the hospital room light like fine wire. She wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with a dignity that took his breath away. John tried to turn his face away, shame burning his cheeks red as fire. "Don't look at me," he whispered, his words still thick and slurred from the stroke. "Please, Margaret, just go away." But Margaret didn't go away. She walked right up to his bed, her steps sure and steady, and sat down in the chair that Crystal had abandoned just hours before. "Hello, John," she said, and her voice was calm as a still pond, without anger or bitterness. "I heard what happened." John's eyes filled up with tears that spilled over and ran down his face like rivers. "I'm so sorry," he choked out, the words fighting to get past his damaged tongue. "Margaret, I'm so sorry for what I did to you." He remembered that day on the highway, remembered the look of complete devastation on her face when he drove away. Now here she was, looking at him with eyes that held no hatred, no desire for revenge, just a deep, quiet strength that he'd never seen before. "I know you are," Margaret said softly. She reached out and took his trembling right hand in both of hers. Her hands were rougher than they used to be, marked by years of hard work, but they were warm and steady. "Why?" John whispered, more tears falling. "Why are you here? After everything I did to you?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, looking down at their joined hands. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word was clear as crystal. "I didn't come back for revenge, John," she said, her eyes meeting his with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. "I came back to take care of you." John broke down then, sobbing like a baby as 10 years of guilt and regret came pouring out of him all at once. But would she truly find the strength to forgive, or would the weight of the past prove too heavy? Margaret moved into John's house 3 days after his discharge from the hospital. The place was a mess, empty bottles scattered around, dirty dishes piled high in the sink, unpaid bills covering every surface like fallen leaves. She didn't say a word about it, just rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Every morning she'd help John get dressed, her gentle hands steady as she worked his paralyzed arm through his shirt sleeve. He'd cry sometimes, overwhelmed by shame that this woman he'd treated so cruelly was now seeing him at his most vulnerable. "I don't deserve this," he'd whisper as she carefully combed his hair. The same hair that used to be thick and dark, but was now thin and grey. "Margaret, I don't deserve your kindness." "None of us deserve the mercy we receive," she'd say quietly, her fingers working through the tangles with infinite patience. "But that's what makes it mercy." The hardest moments came when memories would hit them both like lightning out of a clear sky. Margaret would be pushing his wheelchair through the park, and suddenly she'd stop, her hands gripping the handles tight as she remembered walking those same dusty roads alone, abandoned and afraid. John could see it in her shoulders when those memories came, the way they'd tense up, the way her breathing would change. "I'm sorry," he'd say for the 100th time that week. "Margaret, I'm so sorry." Sometimes she wouldn't answer right away. She'd just stand there fighting some invisible battle in her heart, but then she'd take a deep breath, loosen her grip on the wheelchair handles, and start pushing again. "I forgive you, John," she'd say, and every time she said it, it seemed to get a little easier, like she was wearing down the sharp edges of her pain until they couldn't cut her anymore. At night, When John couldn't sleep because of the pain and the guilt, he'd hear Margaret in the next room praying in that soft voice of hers, not praying for revenge or for him to suffer, praying for strength to keep forgiving, praying for his healing, praying for peace. Slowly, something beautiful started happening between them. John learned to say please and thank you for every little thing she did. Margaret learned to smile again, real smiles that reached her eyes. The bitterness that had lived in her heart for so many years started melting away like ice in spring sunshine, and what seemed impossible began to unfold before everyone's eyes. A new story of love, built on something far greater than pride. 3 more years passed like whispers in the wind, and John's health started failing faster than autumn leaves falling from old trees. The stroke had done more damage than anyone realized, and his heart was getting weaker with each passing month. Margaret never left his side through it all. She watched him grow frail and thin, his once strong voice becoming nothing more than a soft whisper. But those eyes of his, they held something they'd never held before. Gratitude. Real, honest gratitude, mixed with a love that was deeper than anything he'd felt for Crystal or any of those shallow friends. On a quiet Tuesday evening in October, when the leaves outside their window were painted gold and red, John's breathing started getting shallow and ragged. Margaret knew without the doctors telling her that this was it. This was their goodbye. She climbed right into that hospital bed beside him, something she never would have done in all their years of marriage before, and cradled his head against her shoulder like he was a child having a bad dream. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice so soft she had to lean down close to hear him. "I need to tell you something." "I'm listening, John. I'm right here." His thin hand found hers and squeezed with what little strength he had left. "Thank you for forgiving me," he said, tears sliding down his hollow cheeks. "You were my true love. You were always my true love. I was just too much of a fool to see it." Margaret felt her own tears falling then, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of peace, of a job well done, of love that had been tested by fire and come out pure as gold. "I know, John," she whispered back, "and I love you too. I forgive you, and I love you." He closed his eyes then, a small smile crossing his face, and just like that he was gone, peaceful as a man could be, knowing he'd been forgiven by the woman he'd wronged most in this world. The whole town came to John's funeral. People who hadn't spoken to him in years showed up, not for him, but out of respect for Margaret. They'd watched her care for him with grace and dignity, and it had changed how they saw both of them. Pastor Williams spoke about redemption and second chances, but mostly he talked about Margaret's example of Christian love in action. But her journey did not end there, for what she did next touched even more lives. 6 months after John's funeral, Margaret was sitting on her front porch when a young woman came walking up the gravel path, carrying a suitcase and wearing the same lost look Margaret remembered seeing in her own mirror years ago. "Ma'am," the girl said, her voice shaking like a leaf in a storm, I heard you help women like me." Her name was Sarah, and her story was heartbreakingly familiar. Husband ran off with a younger woman, left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of questions about what she'd done wrong. Margaret looked at that broken girl standing on her doorstep and saw herself from 15 years ago, scared, ashamed, wondering if life was even worth living anymore. "Come on in, honey," Margaret said, holding the door open wide. "Let's get you some coffee and figure out what comes next." That was the beginning of what folks in town started calling Margaret's mission. Word spread faster than gossip at a church social about the woman who'd take in abandoned wives and help them get back on their feet. She turned the little house Mrs. Henderson had left her into something like a halfway home for broken hearts. Women would come stay for weeks or months, while Margaret helped them find jobs, learn new skills, and most importantly, learn to believe in themselves again. "You ain't damaged goods," she'd tell each one of them, same way she'd had to tell herself every morning for years. "You're just getting started on a different chapter of your story." Margaret used every penny of the savings she'd built up over the years to start a program at the community center. Basic computer classes, job interview skills, even simple things like how to balance a checkbook when you've never had to do it before. Pastor Williams asked her to speak at the church one Sunday about her ministry, and Margaret stood up there in front of the whole congregation wearing the same simple blue dress she'd worn to John's funeral. "I used to think my life ended on a dusty road 15 years ago," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But God had different plans. He took my greatest pain and turned it into my greatest purpose." The church was so quiet, you could have heard a pin drop. Margaret looked out at all those faces, some curious, some moved to tears, all of them hanging on every word. Every woman who comes through my door teaches me something new about the strength we don't know we have until we need it, she continued. And every time I see one of them walk out that door with her head held high, ready to face whatever comes next, I remember why God let me survive that roadside. By the time Margaret turned 60, she'd helped over 100 women start their lives over. Some became nurses, some started their own businesses, some remarried and found real love. But all of them carried something with them that they'd learned in Margaret's little house, that being abandoned doesn't mean you're worthless. The town council even named a street after her, Margaret Henderson Way, right down the road from the community center where her programs still run today. And that's why, even when we are left stranded by the roadside, life can still bring us back to change everything. This story of Margaret and John reveals a profound truth about the human spirit, that our greatest failures can become the foundation for our greatest triumphs. When life strips away everything we thought defined us, it creates space for something more authentic and powerful to emerge. Margaret's journey from abandonment to purpose shows us that the roadside moments in our lives, those times when we feel completely cast aside and forgotten, are not endings, but beginnings. The very experiences that break us can also remake us into something stronger, more compassionate, and infinitely more valuable to the world around us. Now, let me ask you something that might change how you see your own story. What roadside are you standing on right now? What abandonment, what rejection, what crushing disappointment has left you feeling like your best days are behind you? Here's the truth that Margaret discovered. Your pain has a purpose. Your struggle has meaning. And the very thing that broke your heart might be exactly what the world needs you to heal in others. Don't let your roadside become your final destination. Like Margaret, you have the power to transform your deepest wounds into your greatest ministry to others. The question isn't whether you'll survive what happened to you. The question is how many other lives you'll touch because of what you learned in your darkest valley. If this story touched your heart and made you believe in second chances, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories that remind you of your own incredible strength. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now to continue watching more inspiring stories of transformation that will feed your soul and remind you that it's never too late to rewrite your ending.